It's a pleasure to introduce Ada Tola and Giuseppe Lignano of Low-Tech and their collaborator, Tommaso Monchot, there. And Ada Tola and Giuseppe Lignano are architects and co-founders of Low-Tech, which they established in 1993. Along with their practice, Ada and Giuseppe have been teaching at the graduate level for the last 20 years, currently teaching at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. It was just about a year ago, almost, 11 months ago, that they came to UMass to give a very memorable talk. And I remember as a consequence, so you probably didn't know this, but at Mount Holyoke, there was a real wave and run of students who wanted to study the possibilities of shipping containers. Inspired by your remarks and your work. Tommaso Monchot is an adjunct assistant professor of architecture at Columbia and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and longtime collaborator and contributor to Low-Tech. So it's very nice to welcome you all here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you to our very dear friend Pari and Laura and UMass for this invitation and for allowing us to continue exactly the connection that started with our talk and the exhibition at the beautiful design building at UMass. Although we were hoping to be on the beautiful campus in person, I want to say that I want to express our gratitude to Exactitude because for us it's been a really great process and I want to underline that we started working on this during the lockdown and it has enabled us to, although we were distanced, to have a really exciting opportunity to be actively connected and working on something that went beyond the limited and maybe too exact individual spaces that we inhabit. So this said, Tomas and I will present the work that we've done. I will share screen and then let Tomas in to start. So just give me a second.
And I share that gratitude to Exactitude, as Ada says. And thank you, Pari, for all your magic. You really made something extraordinary happen. And thank you to UMass Amherst. And I look forward to seeing those Boyer buildings. It's going to be my first trip.
Tomas, start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Because the work of Low-Tech is simple, crude, improvisational, and unoriginal, it speaks directly to a discourse of exactitude in architecture. To be sure, the work is simple, crude, improvisational, and unoriginal in a way that also requires it to be complex, subtle, planned, and unprecedented. One framing of exactitude in architecture is to propose that the original and specific inspiration of the architect, which generally comes to her with a seemingly incoherent uncertainty and iterational mutability that are easy to mistake for imprecision, is subsequently ordered by a sequence of unoriginal and generic interventions by technicians of engineering and construction. These are the fields that are, in theory, subject to architecture, but to which, in practice, it is subject. The wild animal is tamed. The work of Low-Tech is not like that. Low-Tech begins with dissections and assemblies of ready-made objects, epitomized by the industrial infrastructural artifact that is the standard ISO shipping container. The initials ISO are significant to a discourse of exactitude, which is not a self-organizing phenomenon in the nature of complex systems, nor an especially self-defining one. The exactitude notionally found or expressed within an object or seemingly closed system is often invented and enforced from without. The exactitude of the shipping container is an artifact of political and industrial power. The International Organization for Standardization, an NGO, was founded in 1947 in Geneva, Switzerland, mythical land of diplomatic negotiation and mechanical precision, and home of Le Corbusier, as we learned yesterday. The ISO has a general secretariat and a technical management board representing about 160 signatory nations, a body founded to inherit the mission of the International Federation of the National Standardizing Associations, founded in turn in 1926 with its own precursors dating back to an 1841 British Convention on Screw Threads. In this sense, the shipping container is not a modern marvel like the case study houses, for example, with which it shares so much metalwork and a mid-century California provenance, but instead a direct consequence of the mechanical and colonial practices of the illustrious Victorians. The ISO standardized the shipping container, variations of which had earlier been adapted out of panelized truck beds over the previous 20 years in 1968. So the shipping container is always already a time capsule from 1968. It is also a box with two vertically hinged doors at one narrow end, fabricated primarily out of 14-gauge weatherized Corten alloy steel, corrugated at a 2-inch differential orthogonal to its long dimensions, with exterior dimensions of 8 feet wide, 8 foot 6 inches high. About 3/4 of all containers are 40 feet long, with most of the rest at 20 feet. The container's mass and structure are concentrated in an edge frame, which resolves to heavyweight corner castings at the box's 8 vertices. These extend 1/8 of an inch beyond the corrugated steel envelope and feature intersecting tubular channels linking its 3 outdoor planes, which enable containers to be stacked and mechanically connected in transit. Typically, they are stacked 7 or 6 containers high, 15 or 20 containers across, with an on-deck and below-deck capacity of around 3,000 containers, enclosing around 100,000 tons of cargo on a typical containerized ship. The typical 150-foot beam of such a ship is calibrated to the historical breadth of the Panama Canal. The 8-foot width of the container is calibrated to the historical dimensions of a truck flatbed, which in turn is calibrated to earlier historical widths of roadway lanes of traffic. And I would mention in parenthesis the lawless sea as a kind of imprecise and unregulated space in which the container is a very precise and regulated object. There are an estimated 25 million in-service containers and a further 15 million ex-service, to varying degrees of probable permanence. The notional obsolescence is not only material or mechanical, which yields a lifespan of around 12 years, but financial. As a matter of carbon, it's appealing to imagine these durable metal objects with a long operational life cycle of hundreds of round trips. But as a matter of capital, it can be more efficient for containers to be promptly abandoned abroad in urban scale stacks at port cities around the world, and not much reused nor reshipped, nor ever returned to their common place of origin, China, the leading global exporter of manufactured goods, including 90% of all shipping containers themselves. Low-tech subjects the shipping container to operations of incision, iteration, combination, and transformation that radically adapt, upcycle, and misuse it in ways that are delicately and intimately informed by the parameters and proprieties of its originally intended use. A built-in exactitude adheres to the object from the beginning and is co-opted and compounded, not resisted, by low-tech's subsequent operations upon it. This built-in exactitude has paradoxical properties, from the quantitative to the qualitative. Quantitatively, it requires the finest fractional calibration, since working primarily in metal allows very little tolerance, that problematic word for the skillful operational anticipation of inevitable physical misalignments. But it also requires an interest in basic whole numbers and integral proportions. The box of the container is 8 by 8 by 40. The mundane ratio of 1 to 5 is our golden section. Qualitatively, the very narrowness and arbitrariness of the container's intended use. Strangely, it is designed to be strongest not in compression but in tension, for the perilous brief moment of claned motion between deck and port, allows for a breadth and specificity in the manner of its reuse and misuse.
Exactitude can be examined and expressed in several different ways through 3 iterations of our recent design research projects of stacks. In ascending order of permanence and complexity, they are Triangle Stack 1, Triangle Stack 2, and Driveline Studios. These projects are 3 and 1. Sequenced here in a linear and conceptual crescendo, they were non-linear and non-sequential in time. They are curated and grouped by the architect as the work of the artist to articulate the growth and development of a practice that is visual and material, selective and found, and highly personal regardless of its generic unit. The first project, Triangle Stack 1, was a simple experiment in briefly restacking and misstacking shipping containers at a storage facility in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, deploying only the forbearance, embodied intelligence, and gestural experience of vehicle operators. We did this on August 9, 2017, between 11:45 a.m. and 3 p.m. We built 2 stacks, which existed for a total of 72 hours. One of these was Triangle Stack 1. It consisted of 18 containers stacked simply and solidly on 3 6-level high sides to form a triangle volume with a 2-foot gap at one corner to allow entry. It took exactly an hour to stack the 18 containers. We organized a sizable structure taking shape, like watching sped up film of a bird building a nest. The geometrical intention that enabled Triangle Stack 1 was straightforward: to test a volume at odds with the conventional orthogonal port stacks, and one that was not just continuous mass, but that alternated solid and void, to outline an unexpected, inhabitable interior void. The critical tool was the empty container handler, a forklift vehicle that can stack a container up to 6 high. It was driven by Steve Alo, a foreman veteran of the port. As in a performance, it required very specific and proficient skills, highly trained neuromuscular gestures to execute a simple yet strict movement. No container connectors or clamps were used to link boxes together. The sturdiness and stability of the tall assembly, close to 60 feet, relied, like a house of cards, solely on the exactitude of the alignment of their stacking points. Triangle Stack 1 is a quick and dirty project. Its reconfiguration is an act of imagination, simultaneously deploying and diverting the existing system that surrounds it. It is a deft action relying on embodied intelligence and sense memory that spatially translates and transforms a generic box without physically changing it. Quick in the sense of alive, vivid, lively, fleet, nimble, alert, agile, and therefore precise. Its dirtiness in this sense is a kind of cleanness, basic and essential. The second project is Triangle Stack 2, a 2020 installation of 18 containers in coastal Brooklyn, New York, developed under the auspices of the Brooklyn Museum, which creates a 6-story atrium-like large public space utilized as a temporary armature for an artist's mural. This was a 3-month public art installation extended to 8 months due to the global pandemic, during which it served as a site of safe outdoor gathering and peaceful political protest onto an available lot adjacent to the Domino Sugar Factory prior to the lot's development. It was a structure of mechanical connection made without any welding. This project required 2 practices of exactitude. The first was the calculation of the volume of water that in plastic tanks within the 2 bottom level containers, in the absence of a physical foundation, would provide sufficient counterweight to hurricane wind load. This calculation followed the determination that water stored within the lowest tiers of containers, not concrete or stone or more metal, could answer the strict structural code requirements and fixed budgetary limitations. More operationally contingent than the mere volume of water was the amount of time it took to pump that volume from a nearby municipal hydrant. To fill 88 tanks, 250 gallons each, for a total of 22,000 gallons of generic city water, required 44 hours with 5 people working over 10 days. This practice of exactitude is directly connected to the quantifiable pressure, in this case 20 pounds per square foot requirement for hurricane grade uplift wind loads that generally would entail an actual foundation. Our alternative and unconventional solution shifted an idea of a hard and permanent concrete foundation toward its fluid, temporary equivalent, water weight, ephemeral like the installation itself, water flow being collected, measured, and contained, and eventually dispersed as flow again. By only temporarily diverting water flow and water storage, the solution was sustainable, and if you seek the poetic, you can find it in the use of the latent storage capacity of the container itself to house water tanks. The communal task of filling the tanks, which was shared by 5 people on the art design team and not by the contractors, provided an endurance experience of the installation that was performative, a repetitive set of operations in solitude and silence, and in the cold of January's winter, meditative, offered us a powerful experience of the installation itself through time, through daylight and darkness, and of its surrounding fast transforming neighborhood. The second practice of exactitude in Triangle Stank 2 was the morphing of hardware, the hacking of a component called the deck connector into a kind of prosthetic attachment to distort and extend the functionality of the shipping container corner casting. Typically, containers in transit are held together at their corners by twist lock clamps designed to allow a 1/4-inch displacement between vertically or horizontally adjacent containers. This accommodation of displacement, how far can the system depart from some optimum order and still work, generally goes by 2 problematic words with opposite connotation: tolerance and play. To tolerate is to have power, to be tolerated is not. To play is to be a liberty, and yet the word in this context describes the limits of freedom. These standard twist locks are conceived for orthogonal stacking only, precisely to prevent any further possible rotation between top and bottom container. To achieve further rotation, are required angles between top and bottom containers, 55, 55, and 70 degrees respectively. The standard twist lock was connected to a non-standard way to a second standard component, the deck socket, with which containers are generally attached directly to the ship deck itself. And then that assembly was doubled and mirrored, yielding a welded connection that mechanically attached the 2 bases together at the desired angle. A precise install and lock sequence was tested, recorded as a tutorial for the installation crew, assembled and welded off-site as an actual artifact, and then closely supervised during construction. The resulting stack, incorporating 45 such assemblies, resting on pins few inches taller than a conventional twist lock clamp, lifts the body of the shipping container 4.5 inches from one another, raising each unit and each level slightly, and exposing that single joint as the recognizable pivotal point of connection. This precise misuse of the orthogonal default of a pre-engineered, pre-tested component yielded this 2,800 square foot, 6-story public space, lifting and floating its generic unit, the box. The third project is Driveline Studios, a 2017 apartment building in the emerging neighborhood of Maboneng, Johannesburg, that develops the stack towards the service system, structural performance, and enclosure that are required by permanent buildings. Drivelines is a 7,500 square foot, 7-story complex of about 100 mostly studio apartments. 2 narrow bar buildings, respectively of 68 and 72 shipping containers, arranged longitudinally at 2 or 3 container width, form an intimate V-shaped courtyard, overlooked by open-air, semi-private corridor balconies converging at a circulation core. The third leg of the triangle was here left open to views of city center Johannesburg. The 140 shipping containers were old and very well used, sourced as city-deep Johannesburg dry shipping container port less than 1 mile away from the site. All exact blue, none exactly blue. Not enough blue containers were available, with the second large batch being green. In the language of Calvino in his essay, here, the work is a balance or tension between the abstract rational scheme, our preconceived idea, and the fine dust of too many words, are containers. The most significant practice of exactitude at drivelines was in the on-site fabrication of the structure. In the developed West, we like the idea of prefabrication. The domes especially could be pre-made off-site with all the seeming manufacturing efficiency of the refrigerators and automobiles which they are later filled with. This seemed cheaper and more controlled. At Maboneng, the opposite was true. Prefabricated components must be designed to be independently structural integral prior to their incorporation into a collective structure. Like the container, they must work in multiples of 1 as well as 1,000. But we realized that by stacking the containers on site and only subsequently incising and reinforcing them, we could use after reinforcing steel that would otherwise be required. Welding leftover corrugation cutouts directly to the corrugated walls along the vertical structural lines results in what is effectively a steel column, composed of the facing aft channels of the involuted container surfaces, a column that is both constituted by and supporting the existing container. Also, in this on-site transformation, a single C-channel is added along the diagonal cut and shared by 2 adjacent containers, the equivalence of which would otherwise have to be doubled, separately measured, cut, and applied. Local economies of labor and material, which to be sure are not universal, made this approach both necessary and possible. For a discourse of exactitude, we emphasize the downstreaming of problem solving. We got behind the labor expertise and ingenuity that we discovered on site. At drivelines, the structural thinking that began with these something from nothing columns then extends to the system of cuts that open the container to the elements and to light. Repeated and mirrored, front and rear, a diagonal line allows the reinforcement around the incised edge to serve also as cross bracing against shear. The sensibility of building up and opening up extends to the slenderness of the 2 building wings themselves, allowing cross-ventilation and passive cooling. The 8-foot given width of the container, larger than what is commonly required by a corridor, deliberately offered bonus and surplus open areas along the balconies and circulation spaces for each residential unit. What would otherwise be leftover space became unpredictable, serendipitous, fortuitous areas of communal social encounter in this post-apartheid urban experiment among neighbors who now call themselves driveliners.
A familiar excerpt from Calvino's Exactitude is his observation that we've heard a few times over the last few days in the standard 1988 English translation of this essay, written as one of Calvino's undelivered 1985 Norton lectures, that, quote, "The word connects the visible trace with the invisible thing, the absent thing, the thing that is desired or feared, like a frail emergency bridge flung over an abyss." As Italians, and more importantly as Neapolitans, Low-Tech proposes a more exact translation. The Italian word is void, not abyss. A neutral, mundane, simple, clear word that connotes lightness and openness, or mere absence, as much as the heaviness and gravity of a long fall. The word emergency is absent in the Italian. The phrase is ponte di fortuna, a fortunate bridge, a fortuitous bridge, a serendipitous bridge, a sufficient bridge. A bridge, if not in preconceived or customary form, then in effect, in fact, by use, by imaginative action. In the Italian vernacular, this has more the meaning of makeshift or make do in English. In a happy confluence of happenstance and desire, we improvise and transform what we have into what we need. There is no emergency, or the emergency is continuous and ubiquitous. We live on that bridge. Calvino addresses limits and measures, addresses how anything determined and precise inherently opens the way to all that is left out, to all of its possible variations. In our practice, we also attend to limits and their transcendence, to the exhaustion of all the possible variations and iterations, and to details. The 3 triangle stacks presented here are an example from an ongoing obsession, the systematic testing of stacks, a long-term project that explores all the generic variations of a 6-level high stack of containers to generate volume and space. With this and all such projects of low-techs are combined what might otherwise seem a false divide between the conceptual and the instrumental, the theoretical and the practical. Work done and undone generates an index or manual for a landscape of possibility that past and future projects inhabit and construct. The next sentence in Calvino's essay, after the word abyss, is this, in low-tech's own translation from the Italian. Quote, "For this reason, the proper use of language to me is one of approaching things, present or absent, with discretion and attention and care, and with respect for what things, present or absent, communicate without words." One can relate to Calvino's use of the word thing, the most generic of all words, and the most inclusive and adaptive, a word that says and does almost nothing, and that can almost say and do it all, just like low-tech's thing, the box. Marginality and scarcity are not sites of sloppiness or vagueness, but of necessarily radical precisions, of discretion, attention, and care. Nothing requires more exactitude than insufficiency, than actions from positions of dispossession and disenfranchisement. Poverty requires precision. The informal urbanisms, the so-called slums or favelas, especially the developing world, require for their operation a constellation of objects of adaptation, ingenious reworkings of available manufactured objects. In Rio de Janeiro, they are called jambiaras. In Bogota, gatos. In Mumbai, jugads. In Tokyo, urawaza. This is a practice of kludges, bodges, hacks, jury rigs, jerry rigs, makeshifts, and makings do. This radical adaptation and intentional corruption of legacy platforms and indifferent systems in the art historical spirit of ready-made and bricolage and arte povera, and of the urban improvisations and informal communities of the global South, in which we include the Naples of low-tech's upbringing, are at the exact center of its practice.
I just wanted to ask you about the Driveline Studios and who lives there, and did you know or who would be living there, the future inhabitants, when you were designing and building the residence?
It's actually a fantastic question, Michael, because it's the very first project that we've done with that big question mark, in the sense that having worked predominantly at a smaller scale, generally client and user were very interconnected. And this is the first project that we did where instead they weren't, because it's a rental building. So, and the idea from the beginning was that it was really an experiment to bring back to city center Johannesburg a new generation. Johannesburg is a city that is very segregated, obviously, but it is also very suburban. In this segregation, people tend to live in a very isolated area, in independent homes. And so the idea of a building that would be really a residential building for renters was an opening to an idea of a model of a different kind of urbanity. So we designed it really thinking about what this community could be, and also thinking very much about ourselves as urban dwellers. The question mark, of course, stayed with us also after, because so much so that we went back a year after the building had been completed and started operating, and therefore it was almost full. And it was really an amazing experience to meet some of the residents there. We did include a lot of the images of that visit, which was very powerful. beautiful. And even more relevant to right now is the feedback that we have received during COVID, because the building has worked really well because of all of its outdoor structure and outdoor communal spaces. It has actually served its community surprisingly well, even in an unexpected moment of the pandemic. So no, we didn't know anything, and it's been a great stretch forward in a practice of understanding, literally just from the standpoint of being very rooted and devoted city dwellers.
Thank you.
I might add to that, building on the theme of the city and adaptation and adaptive reuse, which has come up today, that a lot of the neighborhood of Maboneng is a very deliberate adaptive reuse project of really beautiful 60s and 70s industrial buildings that are nevertheless heir to an extraordinarily ugly history. But this idea of a return to a downtown, a return to a city center, and an adaptive reuse of legacy platforms and building stocks is part of what was happening in Maboneng in Johannesburg. And Drivelines is a kind of radical artifact that is catalyzing those adaptions and those reuses all around it in this particular kind of experimental neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Could you say anything in a kind of adaptive reuse of a former industrial district? Does a city like Johannesburg, are they faced with the phenomenon of having a lack of vocabulary, of gentrification? That's it. Where, the sort of the intended users, somehow the neighborhood becomes popular and leads to sort of tensions between, I guess, more affluent people coming into the city and then displacing former residents.
Well, it's a very interesting point and something that we discussed a lot, because the word gentrification in a place like Johannesburg is actually a word that is very welcomed. If you have never been there, downtown Johannesburg, it's a really interesting site, because the city as a structure that is incredibly powerful. It's a city like Manhattan or like Sao Paulo. It has that kind of urban infrastructure of a time where modernism really intervened, and right now is completely empty and literally just occupied by very, very, very difficult street life. And very dangerous. People don't go there. So we are in a situation, in an urban situation, that is under a very, very different kind of historical status. And this Maboneng was a little bit of an experiment to say, can something be taken back? Can we propose a lifestyle that is not reliant on car, on gates, on security guards, where maybe that can at least stretch out to the level of neighbors? And that's what happened. And we participated into that moment. So much so that the interesting thing is that the building is populated by a very, very mixed group, both in terms of race, financial background, and age. So it ended up being very accommodating to a population that is much more across of people that are interested in trying to explore urban life.
I do think Maboneng may be one of the few places in the world where the power of hipsterism is a power for good. simply as a kind of reverse engineered model of certain ways of performing the substance of style.
You also have to think that we are in a situation where Black is majority, not minority.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for Ada, and I'd like to relay a question that's on the Q&A as well. It's about the first triangle stack that you shared with us. I was struck in the photograph that you showed by the effect of light and shadow on the building. Was this something deliberate as part of the experience of the building? It's kind of Gothic, you know, feeling. And I was also struck by the background, and this kind of ruined building, sort of industrial building with a smokestack. Was that also very deliberate, the choice of the site in which to
I would love to say yes, we curated everything.
Just say yes. Just say yes.
But this is like a great moment
You're a Gothic architect.
It's actually beautiful to hear it described from you. But, you know, we literally had this idea of, can we go as back to the container as is to transform it without transforming it at all? 20 years after having wrapped around about what it means to really transform it, to go through code and structure and all the revisions that need to happen. And then instead we took a step back and said, what if we don't do anything? We just slightly twist how they're put together. And we managed to convince one of the container companies that we work with all the time to run this experiment. And so the only place where they could do it was on this site, which is a very industrial site where they had some of their leftover containers. So it was totally accidental. The only thing that we decided was to do it in the summer during a sunny day. But even the experience of light, the experience of going inside a triangular space was completely new. And we didn't even, you know, it's not that we had run a 3D model, a Rhino model, or anything like that. We just did it. It was literally just an intuition and the ability working with this object that is already at that scale, that exists in that form, to be able to do almost a one-to-one model, you know, that you can inhabit, that you can actually enter and inhabit and experience in the full breadth of the elements. But the excitement for us was precisely that we didn't know anything about what would happen. And it provided the surprise, the spatial surprise, with the added of the lighting and all of that.
Wonderful. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I think it's important that project also occupied a moment in time, a little pocket in time, where there was sufficient space and sufficient surplus labor between the use of that territory as an actual container port. And I think it was being sold to become, of course, an Amazon distribution center. And so there was this moment where there was enough space and enough time to try these reconfigurations. And that's part of what made it such a radical day. And it really did feel like a cathedral or something in there. It's like no space that I've really experienced before or since. And obviously I speak as a fan, but the speed of the making and the stillness of the space were somehow related to each other.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I will,
go ahead, Perry.
I will read Faye's question because it kind of relates to a question that I like to ask, and it's about the big elephant in the room. So Faye's asking, I saw your previous presentation at UMass last fall and your work really resonated with me. I know that you touched on this before, but I'm wondering how your perception of your work has changed and developed since the pandemic. And I just want to maybe expand on that a little bit and say that with your work, there has always been an incredible amount of measure and creative control over the scope. And so even though you have always been working with an object that can be multiplied, added, subtracted ad infinitum, you've always been able to really exercise how and on which terms you're using or transforming the object. And with all the things that are going on and all the transformations that our cities are going through, do you imagine something kind of changing or shifting in your practice where you can suddenly go from something that is a lot more controlled to the propagation of this at a very different scale?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. There's two things that have happened for us that have been very, very, very directed to this question, which are, so the pandemic started at the beginning of the year, let's say in the spring for us, right, in the US. In December, we went on this container ship. Some of the photos were in the presentation that we did today, right? So we had this very powerful experience of being on a container ship for a week, which is no little time, I assure you. And being on a container ship makes you ask a lot of questions on the object, on the content of the object, on the reason why we move these objects around, on the environmental impact that seemed really, really difficult to connect with, and so on and so forth. And then during COVID, the interesting thing is, of course, the global component, right? So suddenly there is this other reason for a global connection, which is we're all experiencing the same thing at the same time. And so these questions of our networks and the visible networks and the invisible networks has been very much with us all along, kind of prompted by the travel that we did on the ship and resonant through this moment. I mean, I don't know if I have an answer, because our answer at the end is our practice. Really, that's the only answer we have. We are committed to our practice. We are committed to the fact that I mean, we are slightly, not slightly, being on the ship was both exhilarating because we were on an island made of steel on the ocean, and this island was built out of our thing, you know, so we were moving in our environment. It was almost like a dystopian experiment of being in our own city or in our own world or in our own environment. But at the same time, the difficulty of thinking about what no one knows what the containers contain. No one, not even on a ship, which is really a difficult thing to deal with. This idea of the unknown of the content. And then the question of the impact. So we were traveling in December. So of course, this question of, is this ship carrying our Christmas gifts, right? I mean, are we moving this huge vessel with this incredible impact on the environment, on this ocean that we're traveling on, to move just menial objects that mean nothing, that our society should do without with? So there are so many layers that are so controversial and complicated in dealing with this object and with its double and triple and quadruple meaning and all the layers of what this object signifies. At the same time, we are taking on the leftovers, right? So we are here in this reality where this object arrives and is stored and is stored and is stored and is stored. And it's a very valuable object that has a lot of inherent intelligence. And so we are committed to continuing and to see how much more can we do, how much more can we push, how much better can we use it, how much more exactitude we can bring to it or it can bring to us. It's definitely pushed us to think in a very different way about architecture and space and environment and materials and creative practice.
I would just add to that two small points. The first is, I think, as we think about the lawless sea, the inexact sea, it must mean something that the first vessels of infection for the global pandemic were cruise ships. And the kind of strange density of occupation in the cruise ship and the really problematic kind of legal, international, national flag status of those companies and their nationalities, and that the cruise ship was the kind of beginning of the moment that we're in. And it makes me wonder if the cargo ship somehow can't be the end of the moment that we're in. And we might unlearn from cruise ships, and we might learn somehow from cargo ships in terms of global thinking and networks of resources and transportation and everything that goes with that. And then also, I'm remembering watching that extraordinary foreman drive those containers around and assemble those constructions, you know, in minutes, thanks to his extraordinary and particular skill. And watching the Triangle Stack 1 go up along with the other stacks that were built on that day in that speed and that scale, it was the first moment where I thought, okay, maybe the Cedric Price Fun Palace is not bullshit. Maybe in a kind of low-tech and low-tech way, this kind of idea that buildings might have their own embodied intelligence and that might be adaptive living creatures, assembling and disassembling in real time, calibrating themselves with all the grace and complexity of living things, to go to some of the fantasies and fears that Professor Piquant spoke to earlier today. In this very straightforward way, no supercomputers, just a guy who really knew how to drive a forklift. We saw buildings come and go within minutes, within hours, of a certain kind and of a certain scale. And so there may be some learning to do from that as well, in terms of the necessary adaptations and the real-time improvisations that our moment of radical uncertainty will require of us, an architecture of instability deliberately to respond to contingency and unpredictability, rather than the opposite, which is a much older fantasy.
Okay, so we have to move, but there's one last question, so I'll read it at least to you, and one of you should try to answer it very quickly.
Ada should try.
No, Thomas, yeah, I answered all the
for
other.
Thomas. So at the end of the talk, Thomas discussed different interests in informal communities, favelas, etc. They're places of maximal reuse and creativity, but it's important to acknowledge the limits of institutional disenfranchisements they operate within. Could you expand on the kinds of inspiration you find in these places?
It's a wonderful question, and a question that I can only kind of ask with the asker and not necessarily presume to know comprehensively how to answer. I think there are hazards. I think there are moral hazards in aestheticizing the patina of poverty, and whether it's a north to south gaze or a gaze from privilege to dispossession, and you know, ruins are picturesque, and what is a ruin and what is picturesque, I think are probably trees that we need to shake and destabilize. And so learning from these places, I think, is a learning that we need to do with care, you know, there's a wonderful coincidence that the instant city of Archigram and something called Resurrection City, which was built on the mall in Washington, D.C. By the Southern Leadership Conference as part of the Civil Rights Movement, right after the assassination of Martin Luther King. Like, those two instant cities happened at exactly the same time. And architects were in fact involved in both. They were both kind of professional projects in a way, one fantastical and one radically populist. But they were exactly at the same time, and they were the same colors. They were yellow and blue. And so the power of an instant city as a bottom-up method of occupation of space and means of communication is, I think, something to continually learn from, or try to learn from. And you know, Ada and I, we traveled to Dharavi in Mumbai as part of our teaching work, and that was a an experience of lifelong impact, and one from which I continue to learn, hopefully with care at this very moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tomas, and thank you, Ada, for the wonderful talk and for answering the questions.